Hello, everyone. My name is Vincent St. Pierre. I'm the membership chair with the Canadian Club of Calgary. I want to highlight that we're trying out something new this speaker season. We're using Zoom. So as you look around throughout the entirety of your screen, you'll see various options to engage with not only the speaker, but with the Edmonton and Calgary clubs. You'll see the Q&A area if you're say you're on mobile or you're on say a tablet. You'll find it on the top, but if you're on a desktop or a laptop, you'll find it on the bottom, and that's where you can actually submit questions for later on. There's also a chat feature which you can also engage with, also either at the top or the bottom of your screen. So it's an excellent pleasure to have you all joining us, and as more folks fit into the room, we'll be moving on with our presentation. So again, one of our volunteers put together this lovely pre-roll video, which I look forward to sharing with you. So please watch and listen in as we have a rendition of "O Canada."
Of Calgary. We have Richard Hare, President.
So again, my name is Vincent. Um, I'm the membership chair for the Canadian Club of Calgary. This presentation today is actually jointly hosted between the Canadian Club of Edmonton and the Canadian Club of Calgary. Our information is not only on our websites, but also on various social media. I will now be bringing on Susan Jolliffe, our Speakers Chair for the Canadian Club of Calgary, to introduce our speaker. So please give me one moment as I promote her to a panelist.
Good morning, and I'd love to start off by doing a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the First Nations, Métis, and the Inuit, whose footsteps have marked these lands for centuries and whose presence continues to enrich our communities. Well, good morning and welcome to the January virtual presentation brought to you jointly by the Canadian Club of Calgary and the Canadian Club of Edmonton. My name, as Vincent said, is Susan Jolliffe, and I am the co-chair of the Speaker Committee at the Canadian Club in Calgary. We have a virtual audience today of more than 350 people who have zoomed in from all over Alberta and across Canada to hear Premier Kenney. Firstly, I'd like to make a special welcome to the many distinguished attendees who are current or former members of the Alberta government who are listening to our presentation today. Next, my job as speaker chair is to find interesting and relevant speakers that our club members can be engaged with. I've extended invitations to hundreds of different people and countless politicians. Premier Kenney is the only politician who has accepted our invitation to speak 3 separate times. I want to thank him very much for making himself available to the Canadian clubs and to all Albertans. January 20th, 2021. It's a very significant day in a year of pandemics, economic uncertainty, and in some places, political chaos. With the change in direction that just happened in the United States this morning, we are interested in the direction of the state of our own province, Alberta. We're looking forward to hearing the ideas and the issues that are facing Alberta in these complicated times. I'd like to welcome Premier Kenney to be our speaker. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Susan and Vincent. I hope you can see and hear me all right. I truly appreciate the invitation, and I thank you to all of you for joining us. In particular, I understand that Her Honor, the Honorable Lois Mitchell, is with us, our last Lieutenant Governor, who did tremendous work on behalf of Albertans in the Crown, and also just truly appreciate her and Doug and their service. And they've been wonderfully succeeded by the Honorable Samala Khani, who's doing tremendous work during challenging circumstances. So let me speak to you today about this incredibly challenging year through which we have all lived as Albertans. A year ago, it seemed that we were set for a real turnaround time. After 4 or 5 really challenging years in Alberta's economy, there were real signs of green shoots and hope on the horizon. The decision of the Supreme Court of Canada a year ago that provided finally clarity on the future of the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, new capital investments, growth in new areas of our economy, all of those and others seem to be hopeful signs. But then, of course, last March, we were hit by the triple whammy. 3 simultaneous black swan events that none of us saw coming. When we first heard about a virus emerging in the Hubei province of China in January of last year, I don't think any of us could have imagined the impact it would have on the lives of so many people so profoundly. I want to talk to you about how Alberta has responded with resilience, with enterprise, about where we are in the fight against the pandemic and where we are going to recover in terms of our economy and our. And I also want to comment on the strong sense of social solidarity that Albertans have demonstrated through these past tough 10 or 11 months. This was without precedent. We were hit by the largest public health crisis since the Spanish flu influenza of 1918, the largest global economic contraction since the Great Depression of the 1930s, and at the same time, fueled by the Russia-Saudi OPEC price war, hit by the largest absolute collapse in energy prices in history, obviously impacting this province that depends so heavily on commodities. Just to put that in perspective, we went from a price of West Texas Intermediate of $72 at the end of February last year to trading at minus $30 by the beginning of April. Imagine a $100 effective turnaround in the value of this province's largest export product. So you all know what the consequences of these things have been. Truly tragic. But at the same time, Albertans should be commended for the tremendous care that they have shown, for the personal and collective responsibility, and for their strong sense of compassion that they've demonstrated throughout this. Let me talk about that resilience and enterprise in the way that we have responded. First of all, as you know, Alberta was the best supply jurisdiction is certainly in Canada, and I believe perhaps in North America, with respect to personal protective equipment. As we've gone through so many phases in the crisis, I think we forget about some of the earlier particular crises, one of which was a shortage of critical personal protective equipment for medical workers and others, first responders, and people in the general population. But this was an example of the Alberta culture of enterprise residing in our public service. Now, people don't always expect to see that, where large bureaucratic organizations aren't necessarily set up or incentivized to take risks, to be entrepreneurial in that sense. But we have a brilliant head of procurement at Alberta Health Services, Jitendra Prasad, who on the very first rumors of a, quote, strange virus emanating from Wuhan in December, surged orders to stockpile what were already largely full warehouses, so that we were able in March and April to share surplus medical equipment with our fellow Canadians as they were within days of running out in places like Ontario and Quebec, underscoring the constructive role that Alberta has always played within the Federation. But again, an example of enterprise. Similarly, our testing folks at Alberta Precision Laboratories within the public health system, they also got ahead of the curve, ordering reagent and critical elements of testing. They did a lot of research preparing for this kind of a contagious disease. And that's why we hit the ground running in March and have maintained since then the highest per capita levels of COVID-19 testing in Canada, and amongst the highest in the world for most of the past 11 months. We demonstrated our spirit of innovation and enterprise on embracing technology. Ours was the first province in Canada, one of the first jurisdictions in the world to adopt a wireless tracing app connected to our contact tracing system. Ours was the first province to develop an online assessment tool, which helped to relieve pressure from our 811 system in the early days of the pandemic. And more recently, we've demonstrated the highest level of the fastest pace of inoculation in Canada on a per person basis with the COVID-19 vaccines. So let me say thank you, as I do every day, to the tremendous professionals across our healthcare system. Of course, most importantly, to the frontline practitioners, nurses, doctors, respiratory therapists, and all of those who support them, who have worked under incredible strain, particularly in the last 10 weeks in our ICU units, especially in our largest city hospitals. Thank you to all of them for their professionalism and their care, but to everybody who's participated in this, as I say, demonstrating this culture of enterprise and innovation in our COVID-19 response. Thank you as well to all of those wonderful organizations of civil society, those voluntary, nonprofit, often faith-based organizations that have shown remarkable care for our neighbors throughout this. We, at the beginning of the pandemic, immediately provided $50 million in funding support for groups like food banks, homeless shelters, women's shelters, and others. We created the Northern Lights Award, which we've been awarding every week to recognize an Albertan or an Alberta organization that has done remarkable things to help people, help the isolated, help seniors, like the Dashmesh Cultural Center, which is the Sikh Gurdwara in Northeast Calgary. Their youth started No Hungry Belly program in March, and they have delivered thousands of tons of food to the elderly, to people in self-isolation, to people facing financial challenges throughout the pandemic. Hundreds of organizations across the province have risen to the challenge and really demonstrated that Alberta spirit. They didn't wait for the government to tell them what to do. They didn't ask really for permission. They just went out there and did the right thing. So let me say that through all of this, Alberta did, I think, very well in coping with the crisis in the first 9 months. We had amongst the lowest levels of transmission, hospitalizations, and COVID-related fatalities of the large Canadian provinces, at lower, in a relative term, than all 50 of the US states, and lower levels than, I think, all but 4 or 5 of the 38 European countries. So if you look at sort of a category of the Western world, because the East Asian countries responded very quickly by closing their borders from COVID hotspots, and they have experience with strict quarantine measures. They have a different policy setting that has served them well. But in the Western developed countries, jurisdictions, Alberta, I think, was absolutely, by any metric, a leader in its response from March through October. And that was really, I think, a reflection of the culture of personal and collective responsibility, because we did that with some of the least stringent public health restrictions, certainly in Canada and indeed across North America. Sadly, that changed following, starting in late October as we went into November. And we can now clearly, based on the analysis of our wonderful Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Hinshaw, and her public health team, we can clearly trace the beginning of that fall surge to Albertans doing what they, I think, naturally would do, which is to gather around dining room tables and kitchens across the province at Thanksgiving. I think people have become impatient with all of the sacrifices, the distance from families and loved ones, and we saw an increase in people, understandably, coming together in groups, small and large, in October. And of course, with the change of the weather, we saw a surge in cases all across the Northern Hemisphere, in many other jurisdictions more troubling than our own. But nevertheless, we got into a pattern of exponential growth in November, with a doubling of cases every 2 weeks and enormous pressure on our healthcare system. So let me speak, and of course, then that we had to impose a very challenging additional restrictions. And I want to thank Albertans for having responded to the call. The sacrifice here is very real. And one of the reasons that Alberta's government has looked at restrictions as a last and limited resort is because we understand that every restriction creates enormous adversity for so many people. There's, of course, the measurable costs in terms of jobs lost and businesses destroyed and people's life savings, their dreams that are under enormous stress. But there are so many ways that we can't really measure this. We do know anecdotally and through surveys that we are facing the highest levels of self-reported mental health challenges and anxiety, depression, and related problems. We have seen that manifest in the past year, particularly in another public health crisis, the opioid overdose death crisis, having lost over 1,000 Albertans to the tragedy of opioid overdoses driven by addiction. And sadly, I have to recognize that some of those terrible losses were the result of unintended consequences of public health restrictions. In March, to be honest, in a rush to respond to the threat that we were seeing in certain parts of the world, we imposed restrictions on places where people gather, and that included residential drug and alcohol treatment centers. It included opioid replacement clinics. It included groups like AA and NA, which ruptured the support that people coping with addiction needed, and that plus other things resulted in partly in this tragic spike. Here's my point: we course corrected quickly, but it's a critical reminder that for all of us, that every restriction can and will have damaging downstream effects on our broader society and on individual lives. And let me take a step back then on that point, because I do want to talk to you about my concerns about the kind of very polarized and unfortunately often divisive debate that we have seen on the best response to COVID-19. I think this is true throughout the democratic world, but it's certainly been true here in Alberta. My concern is this. We have seen, and I think this is true, unfortunately, in our political discourse generally. Lord knows we've seen this in the United States lately. There is a tendency towards a growing polarization, where it seems that people participating in public discourse assume immediately the worst about those with whom they disagree, rather than looking at different points of view with respect and in a tradition of civility. What do I mean by this? Well, on the COVID debate, we have on the one hand a strongly held and loudly articulated view, which is louder, I believe, in Alberta than other Canadian provinces, that opposes effectively all public health restrictions as an unacceptable abridgment of people's rights and freedoms, and that the claim that the cure is worse than the disease, that public health restrictions are being imposed indiscriminately by government leaders without regard for the human, social, and economic costs. And unfortunately, at the fringe of that corner of the debate is a view that COVID its impact is massively exaggerated, or perhaps it's not even a real threat at all. On the other end of the debate, from the beginning, here in Alberta and elsewhere, has been a view that we need to basically eliminate risk, and we should go into essentially hard lockdown kind of policy setting and that anything less than that reflects a cavalier disregard for human lives and the impact on the healthcare system. And the claim that people who are reluctant to impose restrictions are somehow motivated just by a kind of caricature of greedy capitalist avarice or something. I think it's so unfortunate that we've had these two extremes in the debate shouting at one another. And really, I believe the reality here is a lot more complicated. And the best policy response is a great deal more nuanced than either of the extremes in this debate will ever permit. So, and I believe Alberta has done a good job, not by any means a perfect job, but a good job of trying to balance all of these complex considerations. As I've said from the beginning, our goal has been to protect both lives and livelihoods. And more specifically, our goal has been to control viral spread, to prevent an overwhelming of the healthcare system while minimizing the broader damage of restrictions on our social, economic, and mental and emotional health. And believe me, we've had to make incredibly difficult decisions to strike that balance. We haven't always gotten it right, but we've listened to the very best public health advice. We've followed the data both here and around the world. And I believe we've done our best to seek that balance because, as I've said from the beginning, it is the cost of taking a zero risk approach, at least in our North American context here, where we didn't shut the borders right away, would be, I believe, intolerable and unacceptable. Now, if we can find some good news, we have seen a significant decline in the pressure from COVID since the height of the fall spike, which really peaked around Christmas time. Of course, there's about a 2 to 3 week lag between the impact of policies and their measurable outcome. And so we have now seen the number of active cases in the province fall by about 60% since the peak. And we are seeing significant steps down in terms of the number of people who are hospitalized, a number that we follow very closely. So again, I'd like to commend Albertans for having responded. And there is hope with the vaccination program. Again, Alberta's been maintaining the fastest pace of inoculation in Canada, but unfortunately, we have literally run out of supply. We have no more first doses to administer. Pfizer is the largest source of vaccines for us right now, and the federal government, as you know, is responsible for procurement on behalf of the provinces. And it does frustrate me, I'll be blunt, that we are receiving a lower per capita share of vaccines from Pfizer than Europe, the United States, Israel, and other peer countries. And that is an issue that we as premiers have been raising with great urgency with the Prime Minister. But the good news here is that we have managed to administer first doses to every resident of provincially run long-term care and designated supported living facilities. And of course, 2/3 of our fatalities tragically have come from the residents of those facilities. Once those second doses are administered, within 3 to 4 weeks, we should see a significant reduction in the fatality rate, but we cannot let down our guard because the pressure on our hospitals is still very real. The average age of COVID fatalities in Alberta, as you probably know, is 83, but the average age of COVID hospitalizations is 60. There are a lot of younger people who do end up severely affected in hospital, and we cannot let that run out of control and jeopardize our healthcare system. Let me turn then briefly, with only a couple of minutes, to the huge economic challenge that we face. Last June, Alberta's government responded by releasing the Alberta Recovery Plan, a bold plan to build, to diversify, and to create new jobs. We were the first government in Canada to do that because the economic crisis here has been deeper and the challenge has been greater than other parts of the country. This plan involves, first of all, an effort to ensure a strong future for our largest industries, our historic industries, including the energy industry, while also speeding up the process of diversification that has been happening in a real way in Alberta for the past 30 to 40 years. And it's a plan to create the best overall economic conditions to attract new job-creating investment, while focusing on particular sectors that we believe have real promise for Alberta. So the acceleration of the job creation tax cut, the red tape reduction initiative, to make Alberta, if you see the huge momentum of jobs and industries that represent diversification, moving from states like California to Texas, that momentum, that economic momentum, isn't happening by accident. It happened because the policy delta in terms of fiscal and regulatory burden became so great between those two states that now some of the largest companies in the United States have decided to relocate, including Tesla, major tech companies. We want to follow that example, and in fact, to see that shift of capital to a province that has always had a deep culture of enterprise, but to demonstrate that in policy terms. And we're doing it as well through things like the Innovation Employment Grant, that gives Alberta the strongest incentives for new startups, like tech and IT startups in the country. We're doing it through more value added for our resources, like the Petrochemical Diversification Program. And I can tell you we're in advanced discussions with 2 or 3 global petrochemical companies about potentially over $10 billion each in capital investments to take Alberta natural gas and transform it into a variety of products that the world needs. Our minerals strategy, we have rare earth minerals, lithium and others here in Alberta that have never really been developed. We're mapping that out. Our geothermal strategy, our natural gas strategy, which includes a huge emphasis on hydrogen, our investments through the Technology Emissions and Innovation Fund, to make Alberta a world leader in technologies like carbon capture, utilization, and storage. We often think of agriculture perhaps as a legacy industry. The truth is, it's one of the brightest lights in the Alberta economy, thanks to the application of technology, crop science, and so much more. We're going to accelerate that with a $800 million investment that we're helping to facilitate through expanding Alberta's irrigation system to create hundreds of thousands of new arable acres, higher yields. TELUS is making Alberta a global center of excellence in the application of digital and wireless technology to agriculture, developing products that can be exported around the world. The engagement of First Nations, so critically important on all of this, which we are doing through the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation, which is backed by $1 billion of the faith and credit of the provincial government to facilitate First Nations co-ownership of and financial participation in major projects, like we've already announced a major consortium of First Nations who have a co-ownership role in a gas cogeneration electricity plant being built in northwestern Alberta that will replace thermal coal power plants. So in these, I don't have adequate time to get into the breadth of the recovery plan. It also involves, though, a huge, unprecedented investment in building and capital investment to create jobs, good-paying construction jobs right now, in building the architecture of Alberta's future economy. So a $10 billion investment by Alberta's government this year in the capital program, and likely a similar amount next year. So there are so many more issues that I should speak to, but I want to get to your questions. And let me close simply by saying this, that this year has been the great challenge of our generation and our time. But we can look to far more challenging times faced by those who built this province, the First Peoples, the First Nations, who overcame an inhospitable environment to build communities in this place as our first entrepreneurs, who built our first communities, who showed that culture of enterprise and resilience, and from whom we have to learn so much. To the pioneers and those who went through the Spanish flu influenza of 1918, the Great War, the Great Depression, and then into the Second World War. Imagine the toughness and resilience of those people. They never allowed adversity to stop them from building this province. So my call to all of you, thank you for everybody who's involved in the Canadian Club. I know is a civic-minded person. Thank you for that civic spirit. Thank you for your championing civil public discourse. But thank you most importantly for the ways that you have contributed over the past 11 difficult months. And please know that this year, the vaccine program, with recovery in energy prices, and with much more, I truly believe we will get through this. We will get through it, and we will be stronger than ever. I believe that Alberta's best days lie ahead. That's the vision that got those who went before us through more challenging times. It's the vision we must share today. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to your questions.
I would like to introduce you to Paul, Mr. Conway. He's the president of the Canadian Club of Edmonton. So please, one moment as we bring him online.
Thank you, Vincent. And I assume that you'll be taking questions or posing questions as Premier Kenney and distinguished attendees and Canadian Club members. As Vincent mentioned, my name is Paul Conway, and along with German Voon in Calgary, we have the honor of serving as the current presidents, perhaps the COVID presidents of the two Canadian clubs, Edmonton and Calgary. It is my privilege today to formally thank you on behalf of both clubs for sharing your time with us today and for responding shortly to our questions. Now, I don't know about Calgary, but it's certainly a windy and blustery day here in Edmonton. The winds of change are blowing south of the border, and we all hope in our common pandemic experience. There is perhaps a growing sense of optimism that this might all end by the fall, despite the current setback. As Susan mentioned in her introduction, for over 100 years, the Canadian Clubs of Alberta and Canada have hosted important civil public conversations about our country and its future. While the Canadian clubs are apolitical, it is important that we hear from time to time from our political leaders regarding their plans and policies that will impact the future of our families, our businesses, our country, and our communities. As you have summarized, Premier, Alberta faces many challenges: pipelines, the pandemic, a polarization of attitudes, diversifying and restoring our economy. These are all pressing issues that occupy your day, so we greatly appreciate the time you have spent with us. Collectively, we encourage you to lead the province in a manner that Albertans would expect, and to make the tough decisions that will be required to ensure the health of our citizens and to set our economy on the road to recovery. Premier Kenney, again, our sincere thanks for your presence here today and for providing your views on the state of the province. We all look forward to our next occasion to meet, and we all hope that will be in person. Thank you. Back to you, Vincent.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Paul. Appreciate it. Thank you very much. Sorry, Vincent.
No worries. So, Premier, I'm going to go through a little bit of housekeeping as we enter into the Q&A. So everybody, we have some pre-prepared questions, so we won't skip a beat at the beginning. But if you'd like to submit a question, it's the preference is to use the Q&A tool, which is part of the Zoom platform. This is all very experimental for us. We typically do this type of event at a hotel ballroom, and as Mr. Kenney has experienced it before, it's a bit more of a free flow. So the moderation that we bring to today's engagement is a little different, but hopefully you'll be patient with us as we try to engage with this impressive speaker and with this person at the forefront of our political debate. So again, we have the Q&A feature. I already see some questions coming in, so we'll be getting to those after we go through one or two of our prepared ones that we work through with the various executive members of the two clubs. So, Premier, today the 46th President of the United States was sworn in. How do you imagine the relations between Canada and the U.S. shifting in the months and years to come? What new opportunities are there for Canadians?
Well, thank you. I'm actually doing a news conference, as you might imagine, on exactly that question a little later today. I don't want to scoop myself too much, but let me begin by saying that I obviously congratulate President Biden and Vice President Harris on their inauguration today. And I think for as Canadians, as close friends and neighbors of the United States, I believe it's encouraging for all of us to see that the Constitution of the United States, the institutions and democratic traditions have been respected in this peaceful transition of power today, despite recent events that I know we all found disturbing. So just let me start with that comment, that it is so important that the United States continue to be an example of ordered liberty, of constitutional government, and that's what today's inauguration represents. And I just think that's worth celebrating. Obviously, the commercial relationship, the bilateral and trade relationship with the United States is existential for Alberta. Our economy depends overwhelmingly on our exports to the United States. And so we will work closely with the Government of Canada to advance our commercial and economic interests on all fronts. In fact, I was just speaking to Prime Minister Trudeau about this yesterday. And we want to start this administration with a relationship of cordiality and a productive and respectful relationship. However, I am expecting that in about an hour, the president will be signing an executive order to rescind the presidential permit for the Keystone XL border crossing, a border crossing which is no longer hypothetical. It exists. It was built. That's a portion of that project was built last July. Pardon me. I believe this sends a terrible message to Canada on the very first day of a new administration. Canadians wish President Biden and his administration and our American friends well. But we also ask that this country be respected by whoever forms the government of the United States. On the very first day of an administration, to kill a project that is co-owned by a Canadian government that would strengthen continental energy security and therefore U.S. national security, that would create jobs, thousands of jobs, we estimate 43,000 on both sides of the border, that would increase the U.S. economy by $3 billion a year, that would represent $30 billion of incremental revenues to the government of Alberta over the next 20 years. To do so without even sitting down to talk to Canada about it, I find deeply, deeply troubling. And I know the Prime Minister shares that view. He and I spoke about this yesterday. We are going to have to talk about how to respond to this. I'll just say this. The Government of Canada responded to ridiculous U.S. tariffs from the last administration on our aluminum and steel exports. That has an export value of a few $1 billion a year. Alberta energy exports to the United States typically represent a value of $100 billion a year. And with a precedent that will apparently be created this afternoon, in Washington, we are deep. The many other pipelines that are a key part of the architecture of our economy. Line 5, the Michigan governor is trying to decommission that. Line 3, the climate policy advisor to the new president advocates decommissioning that. So we are talking here about a direct threat to the largest industry in Canada, obviously the largest in Alberta, representing $100 billion in export value, all of which would end up ultimately just strengthening the position of OPEC and energy exporters. So I'm sorry to go on at length there, but while we do hope to have a constructive, respectful relationship with the new administration, we wish them well, this is not a good place to start.
Premier, never apologize for giving a full answer at the Canadian Club of Calgary and Edmonton. We always appreciate, the additional context.
Thank you. You guys do more than sound bites.
Agreed.
Thank you.
So moving on to our next prepared question, and I've seen that there's multiple, there's about 17 open questions in our Q&A, so I'll get to those after this one. So Premier,
So I'll try to be brief.
Well, it's so throughout the pandemic, Albertan universities and researchers are at the forefront of medical technology. Between Alberta Innovates and a couple other projects throughout the province and various cities, what in your view makes these institutions powerful players on the international stage and supporting the globe in investments in combating COVID in addition to other diseases?
Yeah, a great question. So, as you know, we do have world-class universities in this province. One of the unique features is the partnership with the private sector, which I think is stronger in Alberta than amongst the public universities across Canada. And particularly in STEM faculties, in engineering, in environmental science and related faculties, because obviously the energy industry here has supported those faculties through infrastructure investments, joint research projects, and so much more. And one fantastic shining example of this has been the virology, the Virology Institute at the University of Alberta, one of whose professors recently received the Nobel Prize for his role in identifying hepatitis B, and that institute is working on vaccine programs with respect to COVID-19, doing critical research on vaccine programs. So we are playing a global role through the University of Alberta. Similarly, the U of A's Artificial Intelligence Institute, which is as we know, a world leader in a hugely important industry, and incredibly important centers of excellence at the University of Calgary and elsewhere. So, look, I recognize that we need to do a much better job of leveraging those centers of excellence at the universities for our long-term economic growth and diversification. One way to do so is by modernizing our approach to intellectual property. So we've contracted McKinsey to work with the universities and to look around the world at the best policy setting to incentivize university scholars, academics, university researchers to do that work so that they have a commercial incentive as well, so that people who work at the universities can participate in the benefits of commercialization. We all know we all have to do a better job of that commercialization. That's another thing that McKinsey is working on with the Department of Advanced Education and the leadership of our post-secondary institutions. Let me just close by saying I know there is understandable sensitivity and concern about some reductions in the Alberta student grant to the universities. Here's a blunt reality. We have great universities. We will maintain great universities, and they need to be accessible for students. However, for reasons that I don't fully understand, we ended up with by far the most expensive cost structure of universities in Canada. Almost twice, our universities receive per student grants that are almost twice as large as those received by comparable institutions in the province of Ontario, for example. So in a province that's coping now with a $20 billion debt, that has seen a 20% contraction of its economy, where average private sector families have seen significant reductions in their income over recent years, we have limited means, and we have to ask everybody in the broader public sector, including the folks who administer our universities, to find more efficient ways of doing business, of delivering their programs. But in that context, we absolutely must not just maintain, but expand those centers of excellence, which can play a critical role in the future economy.
So, Premier, our number one question in our Q&A currently is with regards to the civil discourse. What steps are you and your government taking to depolarize our discourse? It seems many a politician are more interested in blaming their political opponents for problems rather than focusing on solutions. How do you and your caucus plan to improve civil discussion in this province?
Well, I'll share with you one. It's a good question. I'll share with you one way that we've sought to do so, which is uh, significantly to elevate the decorum in the Alberta legislature. Now, I know the vast 99% of Albertans never tune in to watch sessions of the Alberta legislature, so maybe this doesn't register with most people. And I regret that really there's been virtually no media recognition of it. But when I became leader of the opposition, I immediately banned heckling and desk thumping and that kind of, I think, immature behavior, which disrespects the institution. Look, our parliamentary institutions are not libraries. They, they are places where you expect a vigorous and energetic debate, but I believe that kind of debate can happen within the bounds of much more civility. And so if you go to the gallery of the Alberta legislature when it's in operation, you'll see, at least in the government caucus, people, there's no heckling. I won't say that people are acting as perfect angels, but the tone has been elevated significantly. When I began my campaign in July of 2016 to reunite the free enterprise groups within the Alberta political scene, which led to two leadership campaigns, a merger referendum, and then, of course, a by-election, and then finally a general election. I made a point of not personally attacking my primary political adversary, Ms. Notley. To the contrary, I went out of my way only to say positive things when I could. I disagreed, obviously, with her government's policies. It's my job as leader, was my job as leader of the opposition, and that's an important part of democracy, to have those disagreements. But I never resorted to personal attacks, and I tried to be quite intentional about that. To the contrary, I stood up at the founding convention of my party, Red Deer, May of 2018, and I saluted Rachel Notley for her public service. I condemned those who had made uncivil and personal attacks against her and threats against her. And I managed to get a standing ovation from a crowd of partisan conservatives to thank Ms. Notley for her service and her leadership. I don't know, I've never seen that elsewhere. And I didn't do it to get credit, and Lord knows we didn't get any credit. But I think all of us in positions of leadership, we're going to make mistakes. We're never going to be perfect about this stuff, but we all have to make an effort.
So, Premier, moving on to our next question, I'm actually going to merge two questions. One from the Vice President of the Canadian Club of Edmonton, Vicky Grab, and also from our speaker from last year and current member, Ruben Nelson. It's with regards to the Eastern Slopes and the recent changes to the coal policy. Why did you revoke the long-established rules with regards to coal mining on the Eastern Slopes? And how are you, in your role as Premier, not only as regulator, but leader of the province, protecting the lands around the watershed that feeds our rivers and hence our drinking water?
Sure. And thank you for the question. Let me begin just by making a distinction, because I think something's been, there's a basic fact that has been confused in this debate lately. There is a proposal before the regulators for a new coal mine in southwestern Alberta. That application was made in 2013. I think that's 4 or 5 premiers ago. And that application is working its way through the system, through the independent regulatory process, with Canada's and Alberta's high environmental laws and standards being applied. So a lot of the current commentary is about that proposal. Supposedly, I mean, I think there's been a confusion here. The 1976 coal policy did not ban coal mining in Alberta. As you know, coal mining has happened for at least 140 years, mainly up various parts of the eastern slopes of the Rockies. A new coal mine was commissioned 2 years ago, under Ms. Notley's government, near Hinton, for example, just on the eastern slopes of the Rockies there, and they've created 450 jobs. So in British Columbia, they have had on the western slopes of the Rockies, they've had new coal mines built in recent years that are operating under a government of a different partisan persuasion. So I think there may be a misunderstanding that Alberta banned coal mines in 1976 or new coal mining development. That was not the case in the 1976 policy. Secondly, Alberta's environmental laws and restrictions have been improved and strengthened by orders of magnitude since 1976. In 1976, we did not have a Water Act, for example. There was no specific statutory protection for waterways. We did not have the same kind of regional planning that we now have in place. I believe in 1976, there was largely parks and then land that was notionally open for development. We have a much more sophisticated system of protecting different kinds of public lands based on their sensitivity. All of which is to say that the 1976 coal policy had essentially become a dead letter. It had been superseded by multiple new laws, thousands of new regulations, all of which together create much stronger rigor in terms of assessing potential coal mine applications. The bottom line is this. There is no way in Alberta law, with our regulations, with the Water Act, with the regulatory standards that both we and the Government of Canada have, that a coal mine would ever be authorized if it jeopardized our the headwaters on the eastern slopes, or otherwise posed a significant environmental risk. Now, obviously, with any economic development, there is some risk. The regulator has to balance that with the benefit, has to impose certain restrictions to mitigate and minimize risk. So let me be absolutely clear. The 76 coal policy had effectively become a dead letter, completely superseded by much stronger restrictions. I believe the Minister of Energy proposed it be reduced as just part of going back and reducing regs and law that had become obsolete, had been replaced by other regs and law. Unfortunately, I'll admit we did not communicate this well, and so there are many people who believe this is a fundamental change in policy. It is not. There has been coal mining the eastern slopes in various parts of the eastern slopes for 140 years. New mines coming on stream in recent years, but we will not permit mining of any sort in sensitive ecosystems that pose a significant risk to the environment, and particularly the headwaters of our waterways in the Rockies.
Thank you, Mr. Premier, for your fulsome answer.
Sorry for being so fulsome.
No, fulsome is good. Like
we should try a 30-second round like in the legislature.
That's tempting, but I've been watching as our participants level throughout the entirety of this Q&A. It's been pretty level, so the engagement is high. People are paying attention.
Okay, very good.
So, Mr. Kenney, we have a question from James Stotch, who, if memory serves, I met him once. He's the director for Institute for Community Prosperity at MRU. He wants to ask about Mr. Steve Allen's inquiry. And it sort of bleeds back into that civil discourse question earlier in our session. Premier, you spoke today and have spoken in the past about the role and value of civil society. This is great to hear, as so many politicians ignore this vital sector. It's moved. There it is. However, the public inquiry into anti-Alberta oil campaigns could be interpreted as an NGO and foundation, well, and he quotes this, witch hunt. How do you reconcile these two approaches to civil society organizations? How do you properly engage in this effort?
Okay, it's a fair question. And let me say, I don't find it difficult to reconcile at all. I have always said, and we will always maintain, that people have every right to organize themselves in advocacy organizations and interest groups, in policy research organizations, to collectively address their concerns, including about environmental policy. And I acknowledge that many environmental organizations have played a very constructive role in our public debate around the energy sector, for example. Having said that, it's a matter of public record that a number of organizations have received significant amounts of funds from outside of Canada to work against what I believe are the vital economic interests of this province. So this is about transparency. It is not about shutting down organizations. It's not about restricting their freedom of speech or their freedom of association in any way, shape, or form. It's about transparency. We talked earlier about the veto we anticipate today, the retroactive veto on Keystone XL. The very same folks who have been campaigning for that. By the way, we just conducted a poll with our through an American firm, and only 17% of Americans strongly oppose Keystone XL. I think it was 67% supported, including a significant majority of Democrats, including half of people who indicate that climate change is an important issue for them. So you've got a relatively small element in the American political system who are driving that decision today, and those are the same organizations that are trying to suspend the operation of Line 5, which is the major source of energy to the U.S. Upper Midwest and Ontario, kill Line 3, stop the Trans Mountain expansion that did successfully campaign to stop the Northern Gateway project and Energy East. So I think it would be irresponsible for an Alberta leader to pretend that's not happening. There is a highly coordinated campaign to bottleneck Alberta resources in a way that has a very material impact on the lives of people in this province, on their ability to care for their families, to put food on the table. And so we ran on this commitment. So we have a democratic mandate to seek that transparency, but that transparency we're not going to seek to restrict how those organizations operate, and we respect their right to speak their mind.
So, Mr. Premier, we have roughly 3 minutes left on our session. We have a whole bunch of really active and engaged folks sending in questions. Plenty of them. So one element has been, there's Miles Jolliffe asks specifically about nuclear energy and small modular reactors. What steps is the Alberta government taking to increase the adoption of nuclear energy through the use of small modular reactors as a source of electricity for oil sands production?
Great question, Miles. And I personally have always been a supporter and principle of nuclear power as a zero emitting source. And the new developments around SMRs, small modular reactors, is very exciting. I mean, the argument against nuclear, well, one of the principal arguments has always been was the huge cost, the enormous cost, and the risk associated with that. But that is no longer the case with a scalable small modular reactors, and that technology is becoming more widely used. So that is why I signed a memorandum of understanding with the governments of Saskatchewan, Ontario, and New Brunswick last year to work in cooperation with the Canadian Nuclear Association and the Government of Canada on developing a policy framework to support the development and procurement of SMRs in Canada. So we are doing that now. That consortium of provinces started with Saskatchewan because they've got the uranium, with New Brunswick and Ontario because they're the only provinces with reactors right now. But I do believe there may be potential here. Now, there's always been this notion of SMRs providing some of the power for the oil sands that would radically reduce our carbon emissions. And I want to do everything we can to make that possible if it makes financial and commercial sense. I'm a little bit skeptical that it ever would because of the very low cost of natural gas in this province. That can be the low carbon emitting future energy source. But we want to do everything we can to create a clear straightforward regulatory framework that we would support for SMRs if there's a commercial proponent that wants to do those here.
Sweet. As we come to a close, we're at 12:40 on. Premier, do you have time for one last question?
For sure, Vincent, go ahead.
So Bob asked, a professor from the University of Alberta. I'm going to merge about 5 questions into this one. As you work through the fiscal policy, you mentioned the debt and deficit multiple times in our conversation here. Will you be looking at the fiscal framework from the revenue side as a government? And parts of some of these questions have to deal with the possibility of a sales tax, but also part of an open public debate towards the revenue generation side of government policy. So where are you as a government on this subject?
So the answer is yes. Our platform on which we ran in 2019 commits this government to creating a expert panel to review the tax structure and system in Alberta. It's always been our intention to appoint that panel more towards the end of this mandate and to take a wide open view of what and provide advice on what would be the optimal structure for taxation in Alberta. My view, having said that, is in the midst of a deep recession with some of the highest levels of unemployment that we have seen in a century in this province, with incomes that are down, with an economy that is, well, we're probably about 12% smaller GDP than it was in 2014. In that context, we don't think that taking more money out of people's pockets would be a defensible approach. And having said that, as I said in April, when I did a televised address to Albertans about the crisis, I said that there is a great fiscal reckoning coming for this province. We already had a pre-COVID structural deficit of several billion dollars. With the total collapse of energy prices and revenues this year, that has only grown. This year we'll be at a deficit of about 20 billion. But we're not going to cut our way out of that. We do have to continue to find greater efficiencies, but we have to grow our way out of that in terms of economic growth. But even post-COVID, based on our projections, once the economy is fully recovered, we will still have a significant budget shortfall. And there will need to be a very serious debate in this province about how best to address that. My view is I don't think any government of any stripe can responsibly ask Albertans to pay a whole lot more unless we've demonstrated that the broader public sector has made every good effort to operate more efficiently. We went, when we inherited a government operating at 20% higher per capita costs than the average amongst Canadian provinces. Our effort is gradually to get our per capita expenditures down to roughly the interprovincial average. So we can say to Albertans, we've done our part to operate more efficiently, and then we'll have to have that debate.
So, Mr. Premier, I do know you have a upcoming engagement and a press availability coming up quite shortly, and your communications team would probably appreciate having you in the room so they can brief you. So thank you so much for coming to the Canadian Club of Calgary and the Canadian Club of Edmonton, engaging with us, coming for the 4th time to our club, and we look forward towards having you again soon.
I'm probably overstaying my welcome, but thank you so much, Vincent. Thanks to Paul and both Edmonton and Calgary, and I can't wait to do this another time in person. Thank you, thanks, and all the best to you guys.
Fantastic, thank you so much, Premier. So. As we finish with the presentation, I know that we had some questions that were not answered and couldn't have been fit into the 20-minute period that we had. However, I have taken notes of all the folks who've asked questions, and we'll be forwarding it over to the Premier's office, and and if you'd like, following up with him probably for our next event. For Rick, Serge, and Linda, who've put your hands up, please comment in the chat so I know how I can be of service. Rick, I know you asked a question about firearms policy. I'll be forwarding that over. So anyway, but moving on. So as membership chair for the Canadian Club of Calgary, I want to highlight that we can only run events like this because of support from members. The way that we've been able to not only collaborate with other partners by holding events with, say, Governor of the Bank of Canada, Tiff Macklem last year, was through collaboration and being able to be resilient in this time of transition. And the way that we've been able to do that is relying on dues-paying members. So I invite you not only to go to the Canadian Club of Edmonton's website, the Canadian Club of Calgary's website, and consider joining. Because the way that we improve the discourse and improve the discussion is by being able to not only support it, but create active spaces for it. And the way that we do that is, well, not only showing up and creating the spaces and the institutions to actually have these discussions, but making the fundamental investment to do so. Next, you can follow the Edmonton Club and the Calgary Club on our Facebook pages. You can also follow us on our Twitter pages. We're also on LinkedIn and Instagram, so please consider following us there. We have various upcoming events. For the Edmonton Club, check their website. For the Calgary Club, check our website. And we look forward to having more collaborations between all the team members. Thank you from Dr. Owen. Thank you so much for everyone. Thank you for the event. Thank you, Premier Kenney. Thank you so much. I'm looking at all the thank yous. Okay, excellent. But I do realize we had a very limited time with the Premier, which is one of the struggles of working in a very tight timeline. So I will be following up with him. And in addition to this, we'll also be sending a survey to everyone who gave us their emails for this event. So please, we're going to be sending out a survey later this afternoon, not only seeing, do you have any technical feedback? Do you have any feedback with regards to the subject matter? Would you attend again? And if you'd like to actually be connected with your local Canadian club. So please fill out the survey. We use it to improve our next event. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, this is a bit of an experiment for us. So being on Zoom and being engaging in this different world and different way to engage folks, hopefully you've appreciated it. Hopefully it's added to your understanding and has given a platform for action and exchange of ideas and hearing out those in our democratic dialogue. So again, thank you so much for participating today. Thank you for not only your presence, but your attention and for being involved in this discussion. So again, please fill out the survey, consider purchasing a membership, and thank you for being involved, and thank you for being a catalyst for conversations.